Last week I was in Lansing at Michigan's capital, meeting with legislators to talk about my favorite thing, conservation of Michigan's precious natural resources. Since 2021, I've been serving as executive director of the Michigan Association of Conservation Districts and as chair of Genesee Conservation District Board of Directors. Quick disclaimer, this video and the use of my titles do not represent an endorsement from either MACD or Genesee Conservation District. Also, the opinions in this video are strictly my own and do not represent the positions of either organization. You're probably asking yourself, but what are conservation districts, Dan? Well, don't worry, I'll get to it, but we're going to start somewhere else. We're going to talk about the Dust Bowl. Now, if you're not familiar with the history of the Dust Bowl, it refers to a period of time from the mid to late 1930s that was plagued with severe droughts and very high winds. At the time, it was common practice for farmers to heavily till the ground using chisel plows at the beginning of the season before seeds went in the ground, and at the end of the season after crops were harvested. This left the soil with little to hold it in place. Now, this was a problem because soil is a micro-universe. There are millions of microorganisms that exist in a small sample of soil. And when you till heavily, it tends to destroy that microbiology. Without that microbiology and native grasses with deep root systems to hold the soil in place, combined with high temperatures from drought, high winds, well, it was a perfect recipe for multiple dust storms. This was a national emergency. At a time when we were already experiencing the worst effects of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl made it even worse. Thousands of farmers and families lost everything in the Dust Bowl. Countless families loaded up their vehicles and abandoned their family farms in search of better economic opportunities. Most folks are familiar with the story of the Dust Bowl from The Grapes of Wrath, the popular novel written by John Steinbeck in 1939. The novel accurately depicts how hard the times were. I mean, this is a period of time where Americans essentially became refugees in their own country. Predictably, it wasn't until dust storms literally reached Washington, D.C., to where politicians finally took action to address the Dust Bowl. After severe public outcry and at the insistence of a soil scientist named Hugh Hammond Bennett, Congress finally took action and passed the Soil Conservation Act of 1935, which created the U.S. Soil Conservation Service as part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Hugh Hammond Bennett would serve as chief of the Soil Conservation Service until he eventually retired in 1951. He traveled the country and educated the general public through public speeches, farm demonstrations, soil science demonstrations, and other means about the importance of soil conservation. But there was still a problem. Farmers were not enrolling in federal conservation programming offered through the Soil Conservation Service. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote a letter to all governors throughout the country, urging them to pass their own version of his standard Soil Conservation District Act. Each state passed their own Soil Conservation District law, and then the voters took it to the ballot boxes to where then they established districts in their local communities. Hugh Hammond Bennett, ever the champion of the soil conservation movement, would go on to say, "I consider the soil conservation districts movement one of the most important developments in the whole history of agriculture." Today, the need for soil health and soil conservation is just as important as it was in the 1930s. Last year, off I-55 in Illinois, there was a massive dust storm caused by, you guessed it, heavy tillage, dry conditions, high winds. The same conditions that led to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Sadly, hundreds of cars piled up in an accident on I-55, 8 people lost their lives, and dozens of others were injured. Climate change is only making these conditions worse. I believe we're experiencing a Dust Bowl moment right now. But just like we did in the 30s and 40s, we can activate conservation districts to be the catalyst for action at the local community level to address today's pressing natural resource concerns like climate change. Today, conservation districts are still helping farmers conserve their soil and land. The practices we promote, such as no-till cover cropping, not only prevent soil erosion, but they also pull carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it in the soil like a giant sponge. Conservation districts are also helping to address other issues like invasive species management. Michigan's conservation districts also hold an annual reforestation event where we purchase tree seedlings in bulk and then sell them for a discounted price to residents. Last year, we collectively sold and planted over 2 million trees on private land. This is substantial because 72% of all land in Michigan is privately owned, and conservation districts are the only ones who are partnering with private landowners outside of commercial forests to plant trees on their land. In Genesee County, we received a grant from the U.S. Forest Service for $5 million to engage in reforestation efforts in multiple municipalities. We're incredibly excited because we're going to help improve air quality and quality of life for everyone in these communities. Every conservation district throughout the state of Michigan is doing incredible work to address their local natural resource concerns based on local priorities. Sadly, though, not everyone sees the value in the critical services that conservation districts provide. In Governor Gretchen Whitmer's recent executive budget recommendations, she actually recommended cutting operational funding for conservation districts by $1 million. Over the last 3 years, as a result of MACD's advocacy efforts, we are receiving $3 million annually, which equated to $40,000 per conservation district in Michigan. This would leave Michigan's conservation districts with only $26,666 per district for fiscal year 25 in operational funding from the state. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Dan, how can any organization function with so little funding? And you know what? That's a great question, viewer. And you're right. It's because they can't. Every conservation district in Michigan needs a full-time executive director or district manager in order to develop and establish programming. At this amount, the state of Michigan is asking those district managers to essentially live under the poverty level for a family of 4. Hey there, recent graduates. Congratulations on all of your hard work earning your degree. Do you want to go off into the world and make it a better place, conserving our natural resources for future generations in our local communities? Do you like working long weeks with many hours without any benefits like health insurance or retirement? What about being the only paid staff member of an organization where all responsibilities fall on your shoulders? Then we have the job for you. Join us in the exciting field of conservation district management. Job responsibilities include fund development, program development, grant writing, grant reporting, bookkeeping, marketing, communication, social media management, content creation, conservation planning, paperwork, board meeting preparation, human resources, purchasing, policy development, advocacy, hiring and interviewing, IT, technical assistance, FOIA processing, audit preparation, audit response, professional development, and retail services, and more paperwork. What's the starting wage for this exciting, stressful, thankless job in local government that requires a degree and several years of relevant experience? $12.82 an hour. We know this won't provide for your family of 4 without living under the poverty level, but you know what? Maybe you just shouldn't have had kids if you want to work in conservation. Look, I'll be serious here for a minute. I know the state budget making process is long, complicated, and involves politicking among all the members of legislature because everyone has their own priorities that they want to address. There's also a limited amount of revenue that the state has that can only go to so many different areas. And let's face it, no one wants to raise taxes, especially during a presidential election cycle. But if we allow this system to wither on the vine because we haven't given it adequate funding and we're essentially starving it of oxygen, we're going to have far greater problems on our hands that are going to cost substantially more to address. I keep thinking about the dust storms in Illinois last year. This isn't some far-off history from the 1930s. These things are happening now. And we've gotten away from a lot of the practices that we implemented in the 40s to help prevent and reduce soil erosion. After being removed a few generations, many farmers are engaged in heavy tillage again. And climate change is only going to make this worse. Conditions are hotter, they're drier, severe weather events are happening on a more frequent basis. This is a major crisis waiting to happen. And I haven't even touched on the algal bloom issues in the Great Lakes and inland lakes. This is a product of excessive phosphorus that's running off of fields into drainage ditches and then streams and inevitably into larger bodies of water. The algal blooms also produce microcystins, which are neurotoxic to humans and animals. And so if you have a pet, don't go anywhere near them if you ever see them. If algal blooms go unchecked, it means the bodies of water go hypoxic, which means absent of oxygen, and all other wildlife in the ecosystem tend to die and collapse. And again, many of the practices that we promote and help farmers implement on their land, such as no-till cover cropping or harvestable buffer strips, are actually paid for by the federal government. Our partners at the Natural Resources Conservation Service will directly pay farmers to implement these projects on their land. This equates to tens of millions of dollars that go into local communities that turn over upwards of 7 times throughout the local economy. Sadly, though, in terms of total dollars spent through the Farm Bill like this, Michigan consistently ranks toward the bottom because our state doesn't make the investment in the conservation delivery system that the local conservation district represents. This means our state loses out on a serious opportunity to help address many of our natural resource concerns. And it also means farmers are that much more disconnected from the financial incentives that will encourage them to adopt conservation practices on the ground. So if you've stuck around with me this long, please take a minute to sign my petition urging Governor Whitmer and the Michigan legislature to adequately fund Michigan's conservation districts so we can prevent the next Dust Bowl from happening here in Michigan. And the children